Climify is independent of climate designers. The views expressed on Climify are solely those of the host, Eric Benson, and guests of each episode, and do not represent the views of the climate designers. Let's be real. The status quo has created a lot of the world's problems, and we can't rely on business as usual to get us out of this mess we're in. That's why we're partnering with Think NATO this season. It's a dead simple 4-step process to blow open conventional thinking and get to truly unique and innovative ideas. It's not about finding the perfect answer. It's about starting with the right questions, pushing the edges, and then taking action. You can learn more about Think NATO at thinknato.com. That's ThinkNADO.com. Think NATO, the positive action engine. Hey, this is Eric. Welcome to another optimistic episode of Climify. Today, I'm joined by Cate Mingoya-LaFortune, whose new book, Climate Action for Busy People, is something we all need. For me, I'm always looking to do more with climate action, but I'm busy. We're all busy, and I'm sure a lot of you want to do more, but either feel lost on what to do, overwhelmed with life and work in general, or think that small things don't make a big difference. And I get it. I felt the very same way quite often. But believe me, any positive action matters. Every cause you care about is worth fighting for. Thinking back to my interview with paleoecologist Dr. Jacqueline Gill in season 2, I remember that she argued that every fraction of a degree matters. Whether it's 1.5 is better than 1.6, which is better than 1.7, and on and on and on. All of our actions help toward that goal, and collectively, those actions are even better. So who's Cate? Cate is a people-centered climate adaptation planner. She's a community organizer, she's an educator, she's a parent, and a cautious optimist. She was raised in an environmental justice neighborhood and is committed to furthering a future where all people live in clean, thriving communities. Cate got her BA in biology from Reed College, a Master of Science Education from SUNY Lehman, and a Master of City Planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, better known as MIT. She currently serves as Groundwork USA's Chief Officer of Climate Resilience and Land Use, where she directs climate adaptation capital projects, the Climate Safe Neighborhoods Climate Organizing Initiatives, urban and community forest projects, and if that's not all, various other cross-sector field building collaborations. I found my conversation with Cate to be really positive and provided a lot of practical things that I can do any time of the day. I hope you find her suggestions as helpful as I did. Well, Cate, welcome to Climify. I am very, very excited to talk to you about your work and especially your book, Climate Action for Busy People today.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here and hopefully get some nice ideas out on the table for how even busy people can get involved.
And we're all busy. So
We're
this
all
is
busy.
why you have a perfect titled book, because we're all very busy and I have a lot of questions about it. So the first thing though is I think it's the most obvious question, and that is, can I really make a difference on climate and how will I know if I did?
I think you can make a difference. I like to think about climate work as divided into two prongs. One is climate mitigation, which is reducing the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere, hopefully keeping things from getting worse. And then the other piece is mitigation, which is mostly what I focus on. And that acknowledges that we're kind of locked into a certain level of screwed when it comes into the climate crisis, but we have the ability to keep ourselves safer than we think by reducing the impacts of things like heat and flood and poor air quality. And there's lots of small things that we can do in our community to keep ourselves safe, to keep our neighbors safe, and then to keep people in our cities safe. And I'm a really big believer in hyper local action. It can feel really overwhelming to think, gosh, there's wildfires across the country or there's a
Mm.
heat wave in Pakistan. And realistically, you can't do a ton about things that are that far away from you, but there is a lot that you can do within your own locus of control. And if we get enough of those people doing what they can in their locus of control, they can start to tip the scales towards making things a little bit safer for everybody.
Yeah, I've heard the term hyperlocal in one of the other past seasons of the show, and I'm forgetting the name of the woman who talked about it, but that to me makes a lot of sense because what you said is it's overwhelming to think about the heat wave here, and gosh, I'm not there. So, what do I really do to help those people? There's not much you can do. What can help you and your community?
There is, yeah. And I think that there's always, big policy mechanisms and, money that can be thrown at things, but those tend to be really slow moving and it can be hard to feel the tangible change. And one of the most important things that I think is, or one of the things I think is most important about climate action is that folks get a taste of change relatively quickly. I think that really small actions that you can do to keep yourself safe or your neighbors safe, that to me acts as almost a gateway to more climate action if you feel like you've got the time, the space, the capacity.
Yeah.
But even getting those really small pieces in at the level of just a couple blocks from your home is important. I also think it's the right place to start because nobody knows their community better than they do. You know your
Hmm.
neighborhood
Yeah.
best of all. I can't drop into your community and tell you which crosswalk floods or which side of the street is hotter or what it's like when the train passes your home. That's something, and that's expertise and information that only residents have. So it makes sense to start where you have the highest level of expertise and then work up from there.
Yeah, that's totally on par with what I've been thinking about recently, and I want to talk about these items you have listed in your book. But before I do, I wanted to ask you about your journey to writing the book because I looked. You have 3 degrees. You have a degree in biology from Reed College. You have a master of science of education from SUNY Lehman, and then you have a master of planning from MIT. And how did all those come together to write this book?
I think they all came together uh, starting from when I was a kid. I think this has been sort of a lifetime journey. When I was young, I grew up in a lower income Black neighborhood in Queens, New York. It was right in the elbow between two expressways. It was a very tight knit community. Like, just imagine just a pack of kids running wild all summer. Just no adults just being kind of crazy. And like the other kids, I was in and out of the hospital a lot for asthma that was caused by pollution coming off of the
Um,
expressway and then mold that would grow in our basements from the
I'm
flooding that would
sorry.
happen every spring. And I was told a lot by adults in my life, you need to work hard, get an education, and you got to get out of the community. And I was not a super like anti-authoritarian kid. So I was like, absolutely, yeah. And I did it. And I went to college and I ended up becoming a public school teacher and teaching in the South Bronx and East New York in communities that looked a lot like mine. And I taught for about 5 years. And it wasn't until the fourth year that I realized I was saying the same thing to my students that I was told. You got to work hard, you got an education so that you have a choice of where to live. So you don't have to live near this scrapyard. You don't have to live where this space floods. And I realized what a horrifying thing that is to say to a kid that you need to leave
Yeah.
your family and your language and your home and everything that you know in order to have access to a space that is safe from the climate crisis, that's safe from pollution. And that's what made me transition into doing climate adaptation work, which is my main paid work. uh, I'm also a mom of a young child. My daughter was 4 or 5 years old when I was writing this book. I was trying to be really involved in community issues, and I just found myself super stressed out. I'm trying to stay on top of laundry and pay my bills and hydrate and get enough exercise and be a good friend and be a good parent and be a good partner. And found that there were a lot of other people in my orbit that also felt that way. I'm just, gosh, it's so big and overwhelming. It's so dangerous. There's so many big things that are happening with the climate crisis. Is there anything that I can do about it? And through the work that I was doing in my paid work, which focuses on working in low income communities that are disproportionately feeling the impacts of the climate crisis, a lot of small things came out onto the table. When we think of change, we tend to think of this big monumental tipping point where everything turns around and everything's okay afterwards. But realistically, the way that a lot of change happens is incrementally. Instead of one big 100% solution, there's a lot of really small 1% solutions, and you kind of need to tally up a bunch of them. So, in writing this book, what I was hoping to do was to share all of these small 1% solutions with folks so that they could be accessible. Really little things that you can do if you have just an hour on the weekends or 10 minutes when you're walking out your front door. So you can feel as though you're starting to make progress towards a more safe community.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I remember reading, yeah, geez, it was probably over a decade ago about the behavioral science reasoning around if you change small habits, that's going to help you change larger habits, especially around environmental actions where turning off the light, which sounds silly, like I turned off the light when I left the room. Although my daughter doesn't do that, and it kills me, it kills me, and I think she's doing it on purpose now that I keep on t but anyways, like, that's sort of little things, uh, hey, it's a step towards a bigger thing, and I see that with your work as well.
And you can integrate these really small changes. I think it's important to have something that gives you some degree of hope. Generally, I think I'm an optimistic and a hopeful person. I think we can come together and make change. I think that change can be wise and fair and stable and lasting. But I think people need a little bit of hope to cut through the anxiety. And I think climate anxiety is super normal. I think if you're feeling worried, if you're feeling stressed, it means you're paying, I think, the right amount of attention. It's okay to have those big feelings. And also, one of the antidotes to that is doing something. So finding really little things like keeping a milk jug by an old empty milk jug by your front door and using it to water your street tree as you leave the
Mm,
door to go to work. That helps to protect the tree, which is important infrastructure for doing things like soaking up rainwater when there is a storm event. The tree canopy will provide shade. The leaves themselves engage in evapotranspiration, which is basically a little tiny air conditioning type of chemical reaction that helps to suck heat out of the air. And it's a really easy and quick way for you to protect infrastructure that will protect you and your family. So even really small things like that, I think, are a gateway into hopefully bigger actions in the future. Or if that's as much as you can do because you're drowning in laundry and you're working a lot of hours and your kid has 37 sports, that's okay. That's one thing that wasn't being done before. That's one way in which you're contributing to the community that you weren't before.
I remember when I became an educator, someone who had been teaching for a long time came up to me and said, "I have some advice for you." He was unsolicited advice, and I'm not sure I really wanted it, but, he said to me, like, your job as I'm in higher education, so it's like I gotta teach, I I have a research agenda, I have a partner, or at that point, I did not have a daughter yet, but he's like, "You have, like, 3 big things that are 3 jobs, really,
Yeah.
and choose 2 because you can't do all 3 well." And it just really stuck with me because I didn't like that advice. I didn't wanna be
Mm.
like, yeah, what am I gonna do? Abandon my partner?
No.
That sounds like a terrible idea, or
Mm.
I'll just focus on my work and not teach well. No, that's not why I got into teaching. Why would I
Mm.
teach poorly? So, busy lives, but I don't know. It's been something that stuck with me for a long time, and this is actually one of the many reasons why I like the name of your book, which is climate action for busy people, and we're all busy. We all have things that we want to do. So this question is very selfish because it's something that kills me about my life in that I have a daily grind and I get tired and then I'm looking for ways to have meaningful action. I get home from work and there's that Netflix and
Mm.
chill thing that really just it makes me feel good. And I'm thinking about it. I have a carbon impact from watching Netflix, I'm
Mm.
sure. So what can I do while watching TV to act on climate? Because I'm not giving that up.
Yeah, this is gonna sound like kind of a weird thing to do, but I would say watch with other people
Oh,
and build relationships and community with other people. I've been trying more and more to practice what's called scruffy hospitality, where you're like, yep, the hamper is overflowing, but I'm still going to invite people into my home, still going
mm,
to invite them into my life to help build those connections. Because in a crisis event, like an extreme heat or a wildfire situation or a flood, getting to know your neighbors, getting to know your friends and your community members, their priorities, their interests, where they are, what their vulnerabilities are, really strengthening the bonds of that relationship is what can help to keep your community safer in a crisis. Because if I have invited my neighbor Eileen into my backyard to just like sit and chat for a second, I know her a little bit better. I might learn about a heart condition that she has that makes her more vulnerable to heat or some other type of way in which I can be helpful if there's an extreme climate event. So building that community cohesion is something that's really important. It's also something that can be building those relationships can also be really important when you're trying to take that next step into climate action. So, for example, I talk a lot about street trees because they're a really good bang for your buck. And one of the things that you can do is walk around with members of your neighborhood and your community to just check on the health of trees and let the city know, like, hey, this tree's kind of sick. Do you want to come check it out? And you can share that work with your community. So, I think block parties are also a really great
yeah.
way to build community. All you need is a playlist and maybe a bag of chips. And more cities are doing things like providing stipends for block parties and even reducing the permitting barriers for it so that it's easier to shut down the street. That way, you know your neighbors a little bit better. You get to understand them and you build the type of social infrastructure. We think a lot about physical infrastructure to solve problems, but social infrastructure is just as important. Strong relationships with people who can help each other when stuff hits the fan.
Yeah, and you can even watch something as a community that's informational about climate or about something connected to that. So it's like an educational time too.
Or it's fine if you just wanna watch Bridgerton too.
But
And I think that that's okay. Well, one other thing that folks can do if you're looking for things to sort of, like, physically do spring is coming up, and I think this is a really great time
it
for
is.
guerrilla gardening
Yeah.
for vacant lots or parcels of land that are underutilized or uncared for health strips, which in some communities is that strip of land between the road and the sidewalk. You can sit with your friends and put together some seed bombs to give to your
Mm.
kids to scatter around town or that you can scatter around town that will do things like stabilize the soil, that will have a cooling impact, that will provide a home and food for native pollinators, which is important to our whole ecosystem. And you can do that by pulling together some powdered clay, some mulch or grass, or just clippings from your yard, and then some wildflower seeds, and just kind of sit and ball them together with a little bit of water. Let them dry, and then give them to friends, to your kids, to just go for around town to help green the neighborhood a little bit more. So there's lots of sort of small things that you could do that don't require a big physical effort. But I think the most important to me is always creating that social infrastructure because we are the ones who keep each other safe.
That is true. And yeah, if something does happen, we're one of the only homes in our neighborhood that has a basement. And I'm in the Midwest,
Mm.
and
Oh,
we've had
yeah.
yeah, we've had 2 tornado warnings already this month, and so our neighbors know they can, if they need to, knock on our door. "Come on over
Yeah.
quick."
And that's so valuable. That's so
Mm,
valuable to know that somebody can be safe, and it's an important part of that community connectivity. But also, when other priorities come up, you then have that relationship to build off on.
yeah.
So, for example, in my neighborhood, a lot of folks didn't know each other when they moved in. New England is, I think, a place where people are very kind, but we're not always jumping out of our homes to just say howdy neighbor. But in making connections with my neighbors, when something did happen, in this case there was a gas leak near our home that killed a half-mile stretch of the city's street trees,
Oh
it was a
gosh.
lot easier to activate the neighbors to say, like, hey, could you also call the city councilor, or we're having this meeting, do you want to come because we're going to count how many trees have died and send it to the city. It was a lot easier to activate them when I was ready to take that next step of, gosh, there's a physical infrastructure problem. I'm going to rely on my social infrastructure. Because when you do that stuff alone, when you try to impact policy decisions, when you try to get the city, I think almost everybody's run into this situation of like trying to get something done and you're not really sure who to call and you get transferred and then the person hangs up. And so it's a lot easier when you come with a group of people because it's harder for any decision makers or any policy makers or any folks who control the physical infrastructure. It's harder to say no to a bigger group of folks. So building that community cohesion is important at all levels. not just in watering your street trees, but also in making policy change.
I do love the idea of those seed bombs. I went to a art exhibition here in town, and the artist, as you came in the door, had this really big container, and it said "Take one," and they were snowball size seed bombs.
Nice.
Yeah, and there were some instructions with it. I know a lot of the people who listen to the show are on the creative end of the spectrum, and so that's kind of a great idea to incorporate in their creative work is,
Mm.
let's make some community seed bombs and see how we can green our 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 community.
Yeah, and there's so many benefits to that. There's the social aspect of maybe doing it together. There is putting plants out that are going to help to soak up rainwater and reduce flooding. So it feels like such a little thing to say, like, hey, I'm just going to take a little bit of seeds. I'm going to give it the conditions to grow and then just kind of hope for the best. But that can have really big impacts the way that your community impacts the threats from the climate crisis.
Yeah, I remember the artist said, "Do this. Look at the weather and do it right before it rains."
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, make the best conditions you can for it.
we'll be back after this message. The Sustainability X magazine's Global 50 Women in Sustainability Awards for 2025 is now open for nominations. And we're looking for women who aren't just talking change, they're leading it. From fighting for climate justice to breaking down barriers in business, policy, and community, these awards honor women driving bold, intersectional, and systemic impact around the world. Do you know a woman who's shaking up the status quo? Nominate her. Let's make sure the world sees her, hears her, and learns from her. So go to sustainabilityx.co/awards. That's sustainabilityx.co/awards and submit your nomination today. Nominations close May 16th, 2025. Because sustainability without women isn't sustainability at all. One of the things that here on the show the team was talking about was when it comes to the I guess the huge size and complexity of the climate crisis that we're in. What is the average person's locus of control?
I think there's 3 levels to it. I think at the most basic level, what's when your locus of control is gaining knowledge about why things look the way that they do. You don't necessarily have to act on it right away. It's not something that you need to do anything with, but just figuring out, like, why are things the way that we are? We
Yeah.
tend to think that the layout of cities and towns, where the roads are, where the parks are, we tend to think like, well, that just sort of happened over some period of time. But there were very specific decisions that were made to put storm drains in one area and maybe not in another, or to plant
Mhm.
street trees or not plant street trees. For example, in my neighborhood, the power lines are incredibly low. The whole city has power lines above ground, and they're about 8 feet off the ground. So pretty low. And that limits the ability of our city to plant street trees because the power company will cut them down if the branches cut the lines. So even just understanding like what some of the limitations are in the urban space helps you to understand what solutions there might possibly be. Well, street tree planting is not something that can be done in a lot of the city. Maybe that means that the city, or maybe that means I need to talk to my neighbor about us planting trees in our front yards or in our backyards to help green the space now that I know what that limitation is. But and also understanding why decisions were made, who's in power, who decides anything about where the storm drains are located or where public transportation is, and getting to know your local government is really important. So, why do you have a mayor and a city council or town council or alderman? What's the difference? Who makes the budget? Who gets to make the decisions? Even learning about those little things about the way things work is really important in priming you to help make change. If you are someone who is a homeowner and is able to make changes in and around your property, that's a really important locus of control. So looking around to doing things like, do you need your driveway to be as long as it is, or can it be a little bit smaller so that there's more room for rainwater to end up in the ground instead of in your basement or in the first floor of your home? Is there room to add native plants that are going to go deeper into the soil, stabilizing it, creating a cooling effect and a water retention effect? Can you clean the brush from around your home if there's dead branches or leaves to help reduce the risk of fire during wildfire season. And that's something that we think of as like a West Coast problem, but
Yeah,
it
we
is
do.
increasingly a problem. It's increasingly a problem in the South. And where I live in Boston Metro this fall. I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning smelling smoke. And I said, oh my gosh, there's a fire in the house. And so I ran around to all the different rooms and I couldn't find the fire. And I ran to the basement and I couldn't find the fire. And finally, I ran outside to see all of my neighbors in their pajamas circling their house looking for the fire. It turns out that 2 towns over, there was a brush fire where just
Wow.
detritus had lit on fire because it had been hot and dry and had spread through the local park. And all of that wildfire smoke was now just going over the town border into our community. So it's something that we do have to think about is how do we keep ourselves and our community members safer? So I would say start with inside your head. That's your biggest locus of control. What can you learn? What can you figure out about the way things work and why they are the way they are? And then the next is to look just immediately around their home. What's your responsibility to keep your family and your community members safe? And then I think the next locus of control is with your community. What do things look like a block over? What do your street tree or the health strip in front of your house look like?
Yeah, that rings true for me. There was, I think last fall, I live in the farm country here in Illinois, and they took down the cornfields as, the growing season ended, and there ended up being a humongous, like, all the dried up corn caught on fire
Oh no.
just the town over from here, and it was a big deal, and
Yeah.
that really was I didn't think that could happen here. I mean, I'm always thinking California, Octavia Butler's books out there in, California, and so it can happen anywhere, and so we're not necessarily, quote, unquote, "safe" just where we are,
Yeah.
and yeah.
That's something that I found to be really interesting is that a lot of our understanding of our local climate and climate is just it says I think sometimes can sound like a really big and inaccessible term to folks, but it basically means like the general predictable patterns of temperature and precipitation where you live. So like you can kind of expect it's going to be colder in where I live in New England in the winter because we live in a climate that is tends to be colder in the winter. And so that climate change or that shift really speaks to unpredictability. Things are changing in ways that we don't understand. That's why we see freezes in the South, right? Like Texas should not freeze the way that it has frozen a
Yeah, it
couple
did,
times over
it
the
did,
last
yeah.
decade. And it does, yeah. And it snowed in Louisiana this last. It didn't snow in
Mhm.
Boston that much, but it snowed in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of an interesting national cross cultural exchange of how they deal with things. When we first had the wildfire smoke here, I remember talking to friends who live in Seattle and Portland and Oakland on the West Coast. And they were like, "Oh, yeah, I mean, just close your windows and run your air conditioning unit, make sure that the filter's clean." And it was just very quick for them to have that knowledge. And when we had friends in Louisiana who were dealing with the snow, we are like, "Oh yeah, well, you definitely need to run your tap a little bit." So that cross-cultural information sharing is important at the national level, but I think it's also important at the local level because there are people in your community that probably have a sense of how to deal with some of these climate conditions that you might not have firsthand knowledge of. For example, I would not know what to do if there's a tornado, but there are starting to be tornadoes in Massachusetts.
That's
I need
true.
to rely on folks that I know who are from Iowa and who are from Illinois who have a sense of like, oh, yeah, don't look for it. Like go
Yeah, just
inside,
run yeah, go to lower ground. That's right.
go low, get in the tub, get in the
Lay down.
basement. D- Don't be outside.
Well, we're focusing mainly on optimism this season, but one of the things that, we were talking about this in our meetings during the season planning, but I'm really curious about what your opinion of, this question is, and what is a healthy relationship with climate grief?
Hmm. I think that climate grief is such a normal thing to experience. I think folks have it. I noticed uh, climate grief is not only unique to parents, but I notice just the parents in my life talking a lot about it because they make comparisons between their childhood and the childhoods they see their kids having and then what the world is going to be like. I think anyone can and a lot of people do experience that climate grief. And I think
Yeah.
it's super normal. And I think it's normal to view it from a couple different perspectives. One is you only grieve something that is important to you. So allow that to fortify that feeling of importance that you have towards the environment, the built and natural and social environments that are important to you. then I think you can also view it as a call to action to say, hey, this thing is bothering me. I'm experiencing this loss. I don't want to experience further loss. So to take that climate grief and then channel it into some type of change. And that's where it gets really overwhelming for folks because we're talking about literally a planet that is changing. And I think so many of the stories that we hear are, polar bears dying as they swim between ice caps and snow crab populations collapsing. And that can feel so different from the day-to-day experience of me, getting on the subway, going to work, cooking dinner at night, and trying to find ways to connect that. So I think it's really valid and makes a lot of sense to feel that climate grief. And I think it's really important to channel that climate grief into some degree of action. And I'm not necessarily talking about, going and chaining yourself to the mayor's desk. That you like
Hmm.
absolutely, and if that feels like a realistic and important step for you, I'm not going to get in your way. But that's not what action has to look like. And I think
Yeah.
finding really small actions that allow you to feel as though you do have a locus of control, and that you can affect change, and also that you can model for others that change is possible. I think that the biggest barrier that we face is this sense that change cannot happen, and that it is our destiny to
Right.
not be able to slow the impacts of the climate crisis, or it is our destiny to not survive as a species. I don't think that that's true, and I think that that's a path that grief can lead you down if you're not careful. So it's important to shift instead from this sense of inevitability or this sense of feeling loss and of being beaten down, and shift instead to a call to action. It's within my locus of control to make change. What can I do today, this week, this month, this year? What's something small? Once I feel good about that small thing, what's the next big thing that I can do? And to keep plugging at it. The last thing I'll say in it is that the climate crisis and helping to keep our community safe from the climate crisis is the work of generations. So you need to let go of the idea that you or anyone else is going to be able to fix it with a singular or even multiple interventions. This is the work of generations. And it's important for you to do your part.
Hmm.
Carry the water that you can carry.
I wish I had heard this 7 years ago. I definitely was in that climate grief part of my life, and you said the key word there that it was inevitable. I really thought, God, it's inevitable. It's we're doomed. And it wasn't I think until like 2018, I think was the I was writing a lot of dark stories,
Mm.
just sort of this apocalyptic view of the world. And I stumbled across some writing by like Alexandra Rowland, who she was writing about this term called hope punk, which I've mentioned on this show before. In that, again, something you mentioned, which was if it's important to you, then it's worth fighting for. And so that's what really pulled me out of that grief or that funk into where I am now. But gosh, I wish I would have. I wish it would have happened sooner because it was bad.
I totally empathize with that. And you mentioned Octavia Butler earlier. I made the mistake of reading her work for the first time during the pandemic, and she's
Oh,
so
big mistake, right?
right? And she's so prescient that I think
Mhm.
that all of her books should come with like vouchers for a couple free therapy sessions because you're gonna need it to like process your reality. But I think that like I really like that you bring up the idea of hope punk because I think it is a radical act to be hopeful. I think that it's really subversive to be hopeful. There's a lot of people and institutions and systems that financially benefit and that benefit from a source of power by making you think that you can't change anything. So it is a really radical act to say, no, I am a person that does have control. I am a person who can contribute to my community. And I think one of the ways to do that and to move from that I think one of the things that makes climate grief so heavy is that it's really broad and general. It's amorphous. It's a sense of loss that is specific, but it doesn't have a solution that feels specific to it. And I think to your point of saying, hey, this is something that's worth fighting for. You can only fight for something if you know what it is that you're fighting for, and you have to be really specific. So I think moving from something that's general, gosh, I wish I could do something about the climate crisis, to something specific, gosh, I wish I could do something about heat in my neighborhood, or I wish I could do something about flooding, or I wish I could do something about transportation access. That gives you a really clear locus of control that you can then work on. You can make decisions. You can backwards plan from that. If I want the heat to be different, I need more shade. If I want more shade, I need shade structures or trees or bus shelters. Okay, cool. Now I have a path to advocacy. So I think dialing in on one of the elements that is important to you is really important for staying grounded and not floating off into that really overwhelming sense of vagueness and grief. You have to make your own area of focus. And there's really no wrong area to focus in, which is kind of liberating in a way because we need all hands on deck for all of the different
Yeah.
options.
Well, also, I think someone can pick up your book and see all the amazing little things that you can do, even if you're feeling like you're powerless. So that's plug for your book because I feel like the things that you wrote in there are very practical.
I think that like from the perspective that I have of trying to stay on top of all this stuff and having a small kid, I had to figure out what those practical things were. So one of the stories in my book is from just walking my daughter in a daycare. We had about a mile walk each way, which I really loved. And one of the things that we passed by were storm drains that were constantly clogged with
Yeah.
dirt and grass and garbage. And how easy it was to just see my kid, who at the time that we first started doing storm drain clearage, probably 3, and seeing her just pick up a stick and start to poke the clods of dirt through the grate. The next time that we walked that route throughout the rain, there was not so much water spilling over the curb anymore because the water was going into the sewer system. That neighborhood safer, a 3-year-old did it. And so I think that, my 3-year-old can do it. I think we all can
Anyone.
find a niche that works for us.
Yeah. Well, I know people who are listening to this might be wondering about on the job. We've talked a lot about at the home or
Mhm.
taking a walk, just more maybe leisurely things. So I'm wondering about the work environment and what you recommend there. I know I've spent a lot of time filling out like petitions to
Mm.
representatives. I don't know if my job is would be wanting me to do that on their time, but do you have any recommendations for anyone there?
I think it depends what your workplace looks like. I think
That's
that
true.
for folks who work in office parks or at universities or faith-based institutions, the places that you work probably have some degree of land that's affiliated with them. And when you have access to land, you have I think that land is it's a vessel for our values. The way that we choose to use land, what we build on it or what we don't, the way that we steward it or the way that we don't makes a big statement about what we value. And so, if you have access to land through your workplace, petitioning for things like the addition of trees or upgrades to outdoor sewage systems or even stormwater collection are things that you can do to help make your workplace a little bit more climate safe and make the workplace contribute a bit more effectively. I think that if you work in other places, say that you work at a cafe or in retail, I think that there's opportunities for you to advocate for creating safety connected to your infrastructure. So, for example, the cafe in my neighborhood, they erected like a really big shade structure. And nominally, it's outside because there's outdoor seating and it's to keep the rain and the sun off of their patrons. But it actually also cools that strip of the neighborhood. And so there's different ways in which you can pet 2 cats with one hand by finding something that's beneficial for your business while also meeting climate needs. Generally, people want to be cool. Humans don't do great with heat. We can exist in a very narrow band of comfort. When it gets above 75 degrees, it gets dicey for certain populations, and that population expands the hotter the temperature gets. And if you want customers to come in and enjoy a nice iced coffee from your restaurant, creating an outdoor space that has greenery, that has shade structures, is something that's really important. So I think looking for opportunities to pat a couple cats with one hand is something that's important. Keeping the 3 main principles in mind that you want to block or bounce heat away from where you are, you want to capture or slow rainwater, and you want to clean and purify air. So finding any way to do
Mm.
both is a contribution that you can have to your community.
Yeah, I like those 3 things. It's good to remember that when you're doing any sort of action, and I saw exactly what you're describing yesterday. I went to my favorite coffee place, and they had just put up these really nice their branding has this pink color in it, so they put up these pink, like, outdoor tent-like structures right out front, and what I thought was the best part about it, besides the seating was really nice, they installed these little hooks, these doggy hooks, so you could bring your
Mm.
bring your dogs with you, we always want to bring our dogs somewhere, but
Yeah.
there's no place to leash them up.
Yeah, type believe, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that I saw exactly what you were talking about. So
Yeah, and those community spaces are something that's really important too. I think one of the challenges that leads to a lot of uh, an amplification of the climate grief is that for the most part, the dominant culture of America is one that's lonely. Like most
yeah.
adults, over 60% of adults report feeling loneliness. And that's in part because there's a lack of third spaces or places that people can go where they can feel connected to and run into other folks. So that's also another service is creating space for community members to feel less lonely. And I think that when we feel less lonely, we feel more empowered to do other things. We're not meant to be alone as a
Yeah.
species. I don't think we developed that way. I don't think our community is, I don't think our brains are wired
Mhm.
to be lonely for very long. And so finding different ways to cut into that loneliness, I think, is also a subversive act and an act of resistance and one that can help keep us safer from the advancing climate crisis.
Well, what do you think is really holding a lot of people back from taking these, even in your case, in your book, you just simple steps to being productive in climate action? Is it the loneliness? Is it apathy? Is it this like instant gratification that they need to see these changes, and when they don't, they just give up?
I think it's a matter of scale. In urban planning, there's this concept called the growth machine, which is this idea that all of our economic and social systems are set up with the idea of infinite growth, the idea of constantly extracting more resources, the idea that the GDP has to get bigger, the idea that there has to constantly be more of things, more money, more stuff, more places to extract things from. And that does not exist just in economics or urban planning. That expands also into, or maybe it originates from dominant American culture, which is one that's kind of, let's go all the way. Let's do it 100%. Let's get as much as we can done and as big as we possibly can. And we've lost sight of the fact that it's okay to do things slowly. Again, this is the work of
Mhm.
generations. And I think that it can feel discouraging to engage in an act of change or an act of protest or an act of intervention and not have it fully solve the problem. People, I think our brains to a certain extent are wired to solve problems. And when we can only solve a portion of it, I think it's a little bit dissatisfying. And then that's reinforced by the culture. Gosh, if it's not going to fix anything, why even do it at
Mhm.
all? And so that causes us to get in our own way. We are stumbling over our own feet, looking for 100%, looking for perfection, looking for the highest expression of an action or an ideal, when really it would be better if we just did 1%, because 1% is better than 0%. And so I think that's what tends to get in people's heads is they're looking
Yeah.
for this really big panacea, this big action. They're also, we've been told for a long time that the way to get things done, you call your congressman, you write your congressman, absolutely do those things. Or you take complete responsibility by reducing your carbon footprint and line drying your laundry and don't fly to visit your cousin for her wedding. And those two can feel really extreme because the first one, when you write to your it kind of goes into an ether. You don't always hear back from them. And it can
No,
feel like, am I shouting it? Is anyone listening?
he
And then for
doesn't
the other
care.
one, he doesn't care. Exactly. And then for the other side of just taking complete personal locus of control over it, well, what about all these companies that are pouring waste into the waterways? And what about all of these cars that are on the road that are putting exhaust? And it can feel also like I can't make a difference. And so looking at such a those as the only two solutions that are available to us makes us miss this really powerful and robust middle where a lot of small changes and a lot of small interventions exist. And I think that's part of it is this idea that everything has to be 100%. But this
Right.
is the work of generations. It's going to take us a while.
Yeah, I really feel that always having to be productive, solving the
Hmm.
problems, it's like 100%. That's what
Yeah.
is expected of you. So if you do something and you don't see that instant result, you don't feel like you solved it. And
Hmm.
I can see that being very demoralizing for someone who is used to doing that in their job or wherever.
It can be, and then we're also, especially over the last maybe 20 years or so, have been socialized to get that dopamine hit. That's something that
Exactly.
we get from scrolling, that's something that we get from clicking, from our likes, from the hearts that we get on Instagram. We're constantly looking for those small pieces of dopamine,
Mhm.
and I think that folks don't always know that you can also get that dopamine from social interactions. You can also get that dopamine from engaging in that small change. Like there's a level of satisfaction that you have when you have completed the task. When I go out and I hate raking the leaves. I think it's a dumb activity. I don't like it. I don't ever want to do it. but there's a storm drain right in front of my house that I have to take care of. And when I clear that, I do get like a little ding of satisfaction that, okay, I've made a change. I'm gonna have to do it again in 2 weeks because those leaves are still falling down. But I know that it's something that I can do. It has a completion. It's something that I can wrap up. It's small. I can put my hands around it. Probably not as addictive as scrolling
It's
through
not.
social
No,
media.
unfortunately.
But it gets me outside, it gets my body moving, I can do it with my kid, it has a contribution to the community, and honestly, it takes like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
It's the amount of resistance I put up to that task is silly for the amount of time it takes, but,
Mhm.
we all have our vices and foibles.
That's actually one thing I learned when I got a house was that the oak trees, their leaves come down about now. In
Mm.
in the spring, I was like, "Okay, I gotta rake up, the leaves in my yard," and I noticed those weren't coming down, so there was an extra step later in the year.
Yeah, there you go.
You talked about generations and that this is gonna take a long time, and obviously, we've also addressed that as a problem because people want things done quickly these days, and
Mhm.
they wanna move on to some other challenge. So what do your book outlines like a realistic roadmap to climate resilience. So what are some of those stops readers are gonna be taking along the way?
I like so I was a teacher. I was a middle school science teacher. I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And one of the big concepts in teaching is the idea of scaffolding, that you can't take a small child and then all of a sudden they should know calculus. Instead, you have to introduce them to number sense and then addition and then multiplication and division. And you scaffold or build up their skills to be able to do something that's bigger. And some kids will say, hey, I'm kind of done with algebra 2 and I never get to calculus. And that's fine. Similarly, the book that I've put together is a scaffolded book to help get folks from the easiest, smallest, quickest intervention to ones that take a
Yeah,
lot more
that's
time
smart.
and intensity. So we start with the first step, which is just understanding, why do things look the way that they do? Why do some neighborhoods have trees and others don't? Why is that street in your neighborhood really hot? How does the federal government get dollars into communities for infrastructure projects? So, like, why do some places have sewers and some places don't? And so learning that stuff is the first step because our communities don't look the way they do by accident. That means they're not going to change by
Yeah.
accident. And you won't know how to change them until you understand their origin. So that's kind of the first step. The second piece is when you're like, okay, cool, I understand generally why things look the way that they do. Kate explained it to me. I've got a grasp of it. The next piece is on small, incremental 1% solutions, just tiny things that you can do if you've got 5 minutes to an hour. And that's things like watering your street trees during extreme heat events, learning how to keep yourself safe if there's wildfire smoke or if there's a wildfire situation, or helping to contribute to a reduction in the urban heat island effect by painting your roof white or reducing
Yeah.
the amount of asphalt that you have around your house. And then the third piece focuses on systems change. Systems are the way that our institutions organize to distribute resources. And what I'm interested in is seeing a more equitable distribution of the resources we already have to keep people safer from the climate crisis. And so that's things like learning about your city council and your mayor and then asking for changes. And I give a couple examples of systems change interventions that have happened, like when myself and members in the community got a gas leak fixed and got the trees replanted, and walk you through the process of how do you identify who your stakeholders are, who are the experts you need on your side, who are your allies, who are the naysayers that you want to pull into conversation so that you can learn the other side, and it coaches you through what it looks like to engage in systems change. And you know what? If you want to stop at watering your street trees, that's great because no one was doing that before. It's really hard to maintain infrastructure. And if you're doing that, that's fantastic. And if you feel, hey, I have nailed those small interventions and I am ready for the next step to make lasting change at the policy level, the book walks you through that. So, 3 stages: why do things look the way that they do? What do I do about it now? How do I keep that harm from happening again in the future by changing systems?
All great advice. That is really, the one part there that I connect with is from the idea of systems change. Whole last season on this program, we talked about changing the system and, having something of a handbook, like essentially you wrote is I think an important piece to educating folks about the systems that they live in. And you're right, it's not an accident that some places have trees and some places do not. And there's a long list of reasons connected to redlining and race in communities where that was one of the main reasons why the trees weren't planted.
Mhm. And there's also building off of that, the reason why these systems continue to impact certain groups and not others is that the course of that intervention has never been shifted. So for example, in my paid work, we were working with a group of folks in a community just outside of Providence, Rhode Island, and the city distributed its street trees the way that it thought it was supposed to. It was first come, first serve. They put something on the website, boom, trees available. Email us if you want one. Immediately the trees would get taken by folks who had internet access, people who spoke and read English, and then people who had the ability to be online checking the city's website in the middle of the day on a Tuesday. And that was not a very equitable practice. So the neighborhoods that didn't have trees, which tended to have folks that work full time and can't just jump on the computer whenever, or people who were part of the Cape Verdean and Dominican immigrant populations that lived there, or lower income people, they didn't have access to that. So part of what we did was work with residents to advocate for the city to move from a first come, first serve policy to one that prioritizes distribution of trees based on heat vulnerability. So you can do, there are maps, the United States is so generous with the amount of publicly available data. Like no other country has this. You can go online to see all of these really great data sets that are visually presented, and you can see from satellites what areas you probably know already what areas in your
Yeah.
community are hot. But if you needed a map, you can pull up that satellite and you can make that case that hey, shouldn't we be putting the cooling infrastructure in the places that need it most? So that's an example of a type of systems change that the city thought, hey, we're kind of doing it the right way, but they hadn't really considered the externalities or the downstream consequences of that process. And so residents were able to draw their attention to it and then convince them to change their policies. And it's those types of shifts and changes where we say, gosh, things are done a certain way. They don't always have to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
We can choose to change the way that things are done. Someone made that choice to begin with. We can make a different choice.
Yeah, learning about what you just said, when I bought a house that I could ask the city to plant a tree
Mm-hmm.
in my front yard on the easement,
Yeah.
because that's city property. That was something I did not know about, and
Mhm.
now I do, of course. So that can
Yeah.
change the way that your neighborhood looks, just calling the city
Hmm.
about that.
It can absolutely, and being involved also draws more resources to it. So if the city says, "Whoa, everybody's taking us up on our trees," maybe we should look into getting more funding for trees. Maybe this is something that people care about. So that type of engagement, even of requesting services, that gets logged. Somebody looks at it and impacts the budget. So being involved in that way can help to increase the amount of resources that are available for your community.
Well, another thing I want to say to you is thank you for being a middle school teacher. That's seemingly one of the harder jobs I have ever seen someone do. So I appreciate that. Thank you for doing that. And education is an important overarching theme from your book and the work that you do. So it leads me into my final question for you, and relating to education and your opinion. What are the? It seems like that we need to have information about climate at an earlier age. So, what crucial climate topics or engagement areas do you think young people need to learn about more early on?
I think there's 2 that come to mind. I actually loved teaching middle schoolers because younger kids approach the world from a very black and white perspective, and then by the time you're in high school, you can see in color. But middle school is when they start to determine and identify shades of gray, and I think it's a really great time, to start in the sort of 4th through 8th grade period to start talking to kids about the climate crisis and systems change specifically in a lot more detail. I think for younger kids, you can talk to them about like change is possible. Here's the small things that you can do. But by the time the kids get to middle school, they're in this unique space of criticality where they view the problem and the solutions with a lot more clarity and sharpness than I think adults do. They're like, if X is the problem, why don't you stop doing X? Which is very like obviously it misses like some of the nuance of the situation. But I think it's a great time to talk to them about why things look the way that they do. So introducing topics like redlining and covenants and discriminatory practices that made it so some neighborhoods are more vulnerable than others. It's important to talk about their human responsibility to care for other folks. And it's also important to give them tangible things so that they don't slip into climate grief at this young age.
Yeah.
I was talking to a group of high schoolers from Cincinnati, and they were like, well, what do we do? And I was like, well, when you're walking home from school, if you see a storm drain that's cleared, like just use a stick or your sneaker to kick all the garbage out of it. And that's one thing that you can do. So giving them these
Yeah.
tangible pieces is something that feels really important. I think the second piece is an engagement area for young people is to pull them into intergenerational conversations about the climate crisis. So they should know how to and should be conversing with adults, and adults should be listening and conversing with them about the climate crisis. These kids are the ones that are going to be inheriting whatever we leave them. And so that they should have a say about the priorities, about where they want adults to pay attention, and should be supported in making sense of how the systems work and how they can get involved. I think sometimes we think kids are, oh, they're naive about the way things work. And I wonder, what if we look at that a different way? What if they see things a little bit more clearly and more sharply, and it's the adults that are getting tripped up in all of the nuance? So I think engaging in
Yeah.
intergenerational conversations that are bi-directional, us sharing information and the kids listening, and then the kids sharing information and us listening is something that's really important, because I think we're going to need that clarity and that drive and that energy to keep us out of grief. And at some point, we have to pass the torch to these kids,
Yeah.
and they need to feel as though that they're respected, that they are full people with ideas that matter, and that they do have the power and ability to be listened to and to have their voices heard. And that starts really young. I think sometimes in dominant culture, we just discourage kids from
Yeah.
having power in public spaces. And so I think, as much as possible, bringing them with us to do these things, drawing them into these conversations, will help to build their confidence that they are able to affect change.
Yeah, that from an educational perspective, there's that old philosophy of the students are empty vessels and we're filling them,
Mhm.
and that's not true. That's not
No,
true at all.
no, they're people with ideas and wants and hopes, and an understanding that I think would surprise a lot of us if we stopped to listen. So I think that any type of change that we make, but if it's going to be wise, fair, stable, lasting, it has to be intergenerational.
Well, I'm a runner, and one of the things that I saw pop up in my feed was a group of runners in the area that would go out for their run, especially in the springtime, and they'd bring a bag with them, and they would just
Oh,
on their
nice.
way pick up the trash that they
I
see.
love that.
Yeah, so that's something you can do. You're busy, you're going for your run, you pick up all the stuff you see along the way.
Mhm. Yeah, lots of different ways to take care of our community, and I think approaching it from a perspective of stewardship. What are the ways that you can care for this land and the space around it? Because again, I think it's a vessel for our values. So I think that's part of the conversation too. What do you value? And from
Yes.
there, make the connection to what actions resonate for you. Because when you're able to make that connection, it's going to help to make it sustainable, because you got a lot of other things going on, right? Those dishes got to be done, that laundry's got to be done, that dog needs to be walked. You got to make your dental appointment to get your teeth cleaned, and so you have to be able to fit it in. And the
So
way to
many
fit it
things,
in,
yes.
there's so many things. We're too busy. We're too busy. And I think the way to fit that in is to do something that resonates with your
Yeah,
values.
that's great advice. Like, whatever you care about, do that. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Because it's if it's small, that's fine. That's one person who wasn't doing. There are billions of us on this planet. It's okay if we all take a piece of it. You
Yeah.
don't have to carry everything, and you don't have to feel
Yeah.
like you're responsible for fixing everything.
Yeah. Well, Kate, it's amazing. Amazing advice. Your book, Climate Action for Busy People, is a great resource, especially for anyone, because we're all busy. So it was a very, very shrewd decision by the name of the title of the book.
And if folks are feeling extra busy, the audiobook just came out
That's
this
true.
week. So there is the ability to listen to it while you do those other things. I'm a big podcast and book listener while I do the dishes. So feel free to pop that on if you're super busy.
Okay, where can we find you online, and where's the best place to get that audiobook?
You can find me online at catemingoya.com, CateMingoya.com. And then you can find it wherever books are sold. I would love for folks to request it from their library, to request it from their bookstores if they are finding that it's not sold in a particular place. You can also get it on the Island Press website using the code BUSY, BUSY, to get, I think, a 10% discount. So feel free to go to your local bookstore, go online, Amazon, etc., anywhere books are sold, and request it.
Well, thank you, Cate. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. We want to hear from you. What did you take away from this discussion? Email us at climifypodcast@gmail.com or connect with us on Instagram at climifypodcast. We would love to read your inspirational stories on the show in upcoming episodes. This program is produced by Jackie Himmel, Bhavna Bhavani Shankar, and Adam Java. A big shout out to our new designer this season, Tyler Mayfield, and our social media strategist, Brianna Reggioni. Sound engineering and editing by me, Eric Benson. A special thanks to Mark O'Brien at The Climate Designers. You can find design prompts and more information on all of our guests this season at climateDesigners.org/edu/Climify and on Instagram and LinkedIn at Climify Podcast. If you enjoy the work we all do here and you have a spare minute or two, we would truly appreciate it if you left a rating and review over at Apple Podcasts. The more folks reviewing our program, the higher the algorithm pushes us up in the search results. And in turn, the more likely we all could learn how to become climate designers.